Sarah said, I am the native and invasive plant specialist with the Marion Soil and Water Conservation District, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. And I have a little bit of habitat information too. In the past, I've really delved in a little bit more to some wildlife and other kinds of habitat, but we're going to specifically have some speaker talking about wildlife habitat for you, so I don't have to cover that. We've already kind of talked about this, but just the Marion Soil and Water Conservation District, our mission is to protect, conserve, and improve the quality of soil and water in Marion County. And we do that through planning, technical assistance, and education. So we have a pretty robust education program. We have obviously the native and invasive plants programs. Sarah works on riparian issues, and we also have agriculture related planners that can help you as well. And this quote is kind of one of my favorite quotes here. I kind of wanted to start out with this because that kind of gets us right into the whole native and invasive plants. And it is from the book Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. I don't know if anybody's read this book, but if you have not, I highly recommend it. It is fantastic. But his whole premise is that by favoring native plants over aliens, which are invasive plants, in the suburban landscape, and this isn't necessarily just for suburban landscape, it's everywhere. Gardeners and landowners can do much to sustain the biodiversity that's been one of the country's richest assets. That native plants support and produce more insects than alien or non-invasive or invasive plants, and therefore have more numbers and species of other animals. So his whole take on this book is essentially plant native plants, and then you will attract insects, and by attracting those insects, you will then attract other kinds of wildlife and be providing wildlife habitat. So it's pretty fantastic the way he kind of goes through it and the way he sets it up. So what is a native plant? Essentially, a native plant are ones that have occurred here forever and ever, essentially before European settlement, and within a particular ecoregion, which then that is an area of general similar ecosystems and type. So we are in the Willamette Valley ecosystem or ecoregion, and then we have like the coast ecoregion, the Klamath to the south, and the Cascade Ranges in our east. Oops. Okay, hold on. Sorry, having a little bit of difficulty here with this presentation. Here we go. Native plants. So why are native plants good? So they're adapted to our weather and our soils. So living here in the Willamette Valley, we have fairly mild weather, but we have a lot of extremes. We have a lot of water in the wintertime, and we have a lot of sun and heat and dryness in the summertime, which can be really stressful on plants. So our plants are very special that they can survive all that water in the wintertime and then be able to survive essentially a drought all summer. They are reminders of our natural surroundings. So when you go out in the forest, you see those native plants. And kind of the big one that's in bold here is that support for local insects, birds, and other wildlife. They're also beneficial for stream health. We kind of touched on that in the previous presentation with Brenda. We don't want those blackberries along the stream. We'd rather have native plants and trees. And I'll maybe touch on that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. And a lot of our native plants are hardy and they're relatively disease-free. So they have evolved to grow and adapt and be able to coexist with a lot of the critters that might eat them or impact them. So that is definitely a benefit of native plants. And they're also beautiful, so can't forget that, right? And I just like this little graphic. This also kind of just talks about a little different way to show some of the benefits of native plants. It helps us with clean, cool water. Those native plants along the streams, their roots help filter pollutants that might get into the stream, and they also provide shade. The wildlife, native plants benefit wildlife by providing habitat and food. Again, that erosion control piece. And then they're also resilient. They're adapted to our climate and pests and diseases, which I kind of just also talked about. So kind of bringing Doug back into the picture here and kind of talking a little bit more about insects and why we want to have insects and why it's important to attract those insects is that they provide access to the energy stored in plants. So essentially the insects eat the plants and then they convert that into energy, and then other critters eat the insects, which then gives them energy. So then it goes up the food chain. So you're just accessing different parts of the food chain. And then this is a great stat. 96% of the terrestrial birds, like birds that live on land in North America, rely on insects to feed their young. So we need lots and lots of insects. I think in this book, he mentions that chickadees, I think, need to feed their young like 365 caterpillars a day. So just think about, you know, when you see birds going back and forth from a nest, think about how many trips and how many insects that is for them to be able to provide that to raise their young. And then the insects also return nutrients tied up in dead plants and animals to the soil. So we have lots of decomposing insects that help with that. They aerate and enrich the soil. So think about earthworms in that respect. And they keep populations of insect herbivores in check. So that would be something like our beneficial insects, where we have different insects that attack other insects and keep those populations in check, like ladybugs attacking aphids. And then those insects provide food either directly or indirectly for almost all other animals. So that's just, you know, I guess we're talking about plants, but we're also talking about insects. So laying the foundation here for why we need all those native plants. So if we want to create habitat for bees and insects, we need small patches of bare ground, because a lot of our native bees are ground nesters. So they actually will create holes in the ground, and they are solitary bees, and they just nest in small colonies in the ground. We also want to plant our native plants in blocks or clumps of several plants, because that helps reduce the foraging effort that insects have to put forth. So they don't have to go forage along ways in between getting those, whatever their favorite plant species is. If you have large blocks of it, they don't have to use as much effort. Wood of all diameters is important for different insects, and also hollow sticks and twigs. So like mason bees like to nest in hollow sticks and twigs, or you can artificially make nests for them by using straws and holes drilled in wood. Be free of pesticides and insecticides, and like we mentioned, all sorts of different things there. What Brenda was talking about, but those can directly impact insects. And then also use that variety of locally propagated native plants that flower throughout the season, which is really important too, because there's different insects that emerge throughout all different times of year. So you want to make sure that you provide food for everything throughout the year. And then this is just a great example of, if you could see these arrows pointing to these little tiny holes in the ground, which are those ground nesting bee holes. So next time you go out and look at a patch of bare dirt, if you see little tiny holes, those could be from some of our native ground nesting bees. And this is a great example of a little bee house and different ways that you can create habitat for some of those cavity nesting bees. You can see that these blocks have diameters of all different sizes that are drilled. Some are drilled into them, and then they have hollowed out sticks. And a lot of our native plants do have hollow sticks. Like some of these look like elderberry sticks. They're hollow inside, and lots of different plants. I have some checker mallow growing in my yard, and those have hollow stems too in the fall and winter. Those are hollow. And then I don't know if you can see this up close, but if you look at some of these, you can tell that they are plugged by mud. So they already have insects, have laid eggs already in those. And then this is a blooming timetable for native plants in the Mid-Willamette Valley. And this is also in your resource guide. I believe it's in the gardening, the supplemental yard and garden section. But this lists native plants here on the left, and it shows the months of the year across the top, and then shows when they bloom and what color they bloom. So this is helpful if you want to do some landscape planning. You can choose different species. And this list is for flowering plants, and then this is a 2-page document on the backside. It shows trees and shrubs. And then also the bold font indicates host and nectar plants. So for insects, you need host plants, which are the ones that they lay their eggs on. And then the nectar plants are the ones that they get as adults and use for nectar. So moving on to trees in the landscape. So now we're gonna go through, we'll go through trees and shrubs and flowering plants. And I just have a few examples kind of each one. You know, there's so many different native plants, but I just chose kind of a few of the powerhouse plants in each of the categories that we can talk about. So trees in the landscape provide that, you know, vertical structure, lots of shade. They really help with erosion control because a lot of them have deep roots or roots that spread out quite far. Cascara is the first one on this list, and this is a small tree. It only grows about 30 feet tall, but it does get small flowers, and then it produces purple berries, which are a food source for birds. And it attracts a number of different fruit-eating birds and also the insects with the flowers, and then a couple different butterfly species. And it can grow in sun to full shade and likes moist to well-drained soils. So it's pretty adaptable where it grows. And it's fairly common in the forest, but you don't really notice it. The next plant is a big leaf maple, and this one is very common. I'm sure most people know big leaf maple. This is a great plant for wildlife. It also produces flowers, this cluster of flowers, then that turns into the seeds, which are the helicopters that everybody likes to play with, right? And it does have those giant leaves. And the cool thing about maple is that pollinators really love these when they bloom. In the springtime. I've been standing under big leaf maples, and you can just hear the whole tree buzzing as the pollinators are using that and utilizing the pollen in there and the nectar. And then most of the larger big leaf maples have a lot of moss on the north side of the tree where that's very shaded. So that moss then supports different insects and different critters, which then the birds love to get in there and use those insects. And also they're usually really tall, so larger birds nest in the trees. Yeah, it can be, and squirrels love the big leaf maple too, so they like to nest in it too. And some people have them, you know, depends if you like squirrels or not. Moving on to Oregon white oak. These are fantastic trees. They're very slow growing, and oak habitats are rare and declining in the Willamette Valley. Most of the places where we have oaks growing have been converted for development or farmland. A lot of the oaks that are left now are either growing kind of on rocky, unfarmable areas or on like steeper slopes and hillsides. I mean, some are, you know, have been preserved. And the acorns are really important to a lot of different species. We have this acorn woodpecker here in the middle. They only eat acorns, and they like to nest in these oak trees. And western gray squirrels are associated with oak habitats, and so are these white-breasted nuthatches. And all of these are conservation strategy species and kind of declining species according to the Oregon Conservation Strategy. And over 150 species of wildlife have been documented using Oregon white oak. So that just kind of shows you the importance of these fantastic trees. And just to kind of talk a little bit more about oak habitats, I hope some folks have oaks on their property that are in the class. I know at least a few of you do. There's, like I said, lots of threats to oak habitats, the agriculture and urban development, invasive plants crowding out some of those oak species, or at least inhibiting some natural regeneration and small seedling growth. And the absence of disturbance regimes, so fire and flooding, which were pretty prevalent before European settlement. Native Americans used a lot of fire to manage their lands, and we had a lot of flooding down in the Willamette Valley with the Willamette River bottom. And then also encroachment by woody vegetation, creating that closed canopy. So Douglas fir kind of encroaching down from the mountains and coming into the valley. And they grow a lot faster than the oaks, so they are able to grow up into those oaks and shade them. And then the oaks don't grow out those big branching limbs, which are really important for acorn production if they're too crowded by either other oaks or by Douglas fir or maples or other faster growing species. So if you have oaks, just a few things that you can do, protect those ones that are on your property. Remove those conifers that are around the oaks, so you give them space and sunshine. Again, remove the invasive species. Plant new oaks if you have space to plant them. And then kind of reestablish some of those native plant habitats to help compete with some of the invasives if you have that. You could thin oaks in areas where the canopy is closed. Again, that kind of goes back to that disturbance regime by reducing the amount of fire in the valley. Some oaks have grown up very close to each other and they end up being really tall and spindly instead of those big branching ones that we want. And then enjoy your oak habitat, because it is a fantastic and beautiful habitat. So moving on to shrubs in the landscape. They provide great shelter for wildlife. They are kind of a different level, they provide that different habitat level from the canopy of the tall trees. They're just a lower habitat level, and they're really great for erosion control along streams. A lot of our shrubs flower, so they're great for pollinators, and then they're kind of an eye level interest for us. They're shorter. So red and blue elderberries, they're pretty hard to tell apart if they don't have flowers or berries on them, but they're both great for wildlife. Blue elderberries can handle sunnier, drier sites, and the red elderberries can tolerate a little bit more shade and maybe a little bit wetter habitats. They're both pretty fast growing. It only takes a couple years for them to get several feet tall. And there's a lot of wildlife species that have been documented using these. So you can see kind of the list up here. Moving on to red flowering currant. I know this is a favorite of a lot of people. It flowers pretty early in the season. It can handle part shade to full sun and moist to well-drained soils. And it's a favorite of hummingbirds, particularly rufous hummingbirds. The rufous hummingbirds migrate, so when they are returning to the north in the Willamette Valley, they return about the same time that the red flowering currant is blooming. So it's a great food source for them. And the currants usually bloom in March. So it's one of the kind of first things that you see in springtime. So it's a great sign of spring. And they also get berries that are edible for birds and wildlife, and they're also edible to humans. They're kind of seedy, but they're not that bitter. They don't taste particularly awesome, but thimbleberries are my personal favorite. But these are also okay if you want to try them. Serviceberry, another edible fruit for humans. These actually taste pretty good. Birds love the berries too. Deer also love them. So if you have deer, careful planting serviceberry. It gets nice clusters of white flowers in kind of mid-spring. Serviceberry can handle kind of droughtier conditions, and it will do good in sun to part shade. And it's good for all different kinds of wildlife. You can see lots of birds, especially those berry eaters like the cedar waxwing. And then blue blossom is one of my personal favorite shrubs. It is native kind of more in the southern Willamette Valley and kind of down south of Eugene, but it does just fine kind of up here in the Willamette Valley. It's evergreen, which makes it really nice, and it gets these beautiful blue blossoms in May. And this attracts so many bees while it's blooming for the couple weeks that it's blooming, but it can handle full sun, drained, dry soil, like fairly harsh conditions. I have mine kind of growing on the southwest corner of my house, and I hardly ever have to water it. It doesn't like water in the summertime, but so many bees on this plant. It's kind of ridiculous how many bees you can see buzzing around this plant. I just stand there and stare at it and watch them. And I wish I could do it all day. And then some bird species also use this tree. And a lot of birds in my yard use it as shelter and cover too. They get pretty big pretty fast. They can be 15 to 20 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter pretty quickly. Mine is way too close to my house, and so I have to chop it down almost every year because it grows up into the eaves of the house. So unfortunate spacing for that, but I'm not going to cut it down. So I just wanted to put this in here just in case some of you were wondering. I kind of alluded to some deer before, what things they like. But these are plants not preferred by deer. So you'll see I kind of emphasize that not preferred piece because if deer are hungry enough, they will eat almost anything. So there are several flowering plants and trees and a few different shrubs that that deer don't prefer. So if you want this list, I can email it to you. I'm going to kind of zip through this pretty fast here and move on to the next slide. But just let us know. And then ground. Oh,
can you hear me? I think they actually have that list in their thumb drives.
Oh, did I put it in there? Okay,
I think it's in the additional materials folder online actually. So if you guys want to access that, you can find it there.
Okay, perfect. I'm ahead of myself. Always prepared. All right, so next is ground covers and herbaceous plants. So again, these protect the soil from compaction by rain because they break up those raindrops. They also provide hiding places for small creatures and help prevent erosion. And a lot of the flowering plants are great for pollinators. And there's a lot of different varieties of ground covers and herbaceous plants. So they provide great interest for the garden landscape. This is camas. We have two different species in the Willamette Valley. We have a grape camas and a common camas. And one of the subspecies varieties has white flowers, which is really pretty. This was a first food by the Native Americans. They would, it's a bulb, so they would harvest the bulbs and they ate the bulbs. I haven't tried any. I have meant to do that. I will do that this year because I have a lot of it in my yard. So I will report back and let you know. But they're very easy to grow. They do like a little bit of extra kind of wet moisture in the winter time. They can tolerate standing water for parts of the year. And then they really like to dry out in the summertime. but they do provide beautiful purple blooms. It's another great pollinator plant. The deer don't seem to eat mine too much. Occasionally I'll see a few kind of nibbled on, but they leave this one alone. Douglas aster, I have a love-hate relationship with this plant. I love it because it's great for pollinators. It blooms late in the year. It starts blooming in around August, and I had some blooming into mid-October this year. So it attracts all those late pollinators. It can be very aggressive and very prolific. Careful what you wish for with this plant. I have it all over my yard. It even grows like in the street between the curb and the road. It's like growing in all these little tiny cracks. It's growing in my lawn. I mow it. But it provides great seed. So finches and juncos love to eat the seed. So I don't like to cut it down because I want to leave those seeds for the birds in like November and December. It still has seeds on it, but then it spreads all over and I have them all over. So that's my love-hate relationship with Douglas aster, but it's still a great plant. Don't let that discourage you. If you're just more proactive and on top of it, you can cut it down and prevent it from spreading. And it's also pretty easy to pull up the young starts. Oops. Oregon sunshine. This is another great pollinator plant. You can see I got pictures of some with bees on them. And this is just a bright little cheery plant. There's two forms of this plant. One is kind of a creeping ground cover, and one kind of is a more upright plant that grows about 2 feet tall. This also grows on the east side of the Cascades too. So it kind of grows in both places, but it can be pretty drought tolerant here in the valley, and it can handle full sun. Just a great, nice garden plant for your yard. This is wild ginger and redwood sorrel. These are both shade-loving plants. The redwood sorrel you can see is kind of that clover-looking plant here, and then the wild ginger has these kind of darker, leathery, heart-shaped leaves. The wild ginger kind of stays evergreen. It stays there most of the year. And this is the super cool bloom of the wild ginger. It blooms underneath the plant. So these are just laying like on the ground. So you kind of have to lift up the leaves to see it, but they're really unique flowers. If you get the chance to see them in person, it's a kind of a great plant. I don't know that there's a lot of pollinators that use either of these plants, but I wanted to put something in here, just some shade loving plants to give sort of a variety. And then another shade plant is fringe cup. And this one is I like to recommend this if people are looking for a shady ground cover. It spreads pretty quickly and self-propagates and moves around within an area, but it's not as aggressive as the Douglas aster. But I have this kind of filling in a lot of the shady areas on the north side of my house, and it has filled in the beds really well around some of the other things that I have planted. And the little fringe on the cups of the flowers turns pink as it ages. This is Western geranium. It has beautiful pink flowers, fantastic for pollinators, can handle full sun, fairly dry soils. If you water it more during the summertime, you'll get more continued flowers and blooms. And big leaf lupin. A lot of the lupins are great. There are several different species. They're all great for pollinators. It's a pretty hardy plant as well. This big leaf lupin can get about 3 feet tall and kind of 2 feet in diameter. Some of the other ones are a little bit smaller. All the native lupins usually have purple flowers. Some of them are a little bit whiter. And this one is Oregon stonecrop. It's a sedum. This is fairly drought tolerant. I have it growing in a rock garden in part of my yard. It gets nice yellow flowers. And this plant is pretty hardy. It can withstand some harsh, like pretty sunny, dry conditions. And that kind of leads me into climate resiliency. We kind of wanted to put some of these just to kind of get you thinking about it a little bit, and how climate change can influence the distribution of different plant species in the future. With the different weather patterns, we're going to have more extreme weather, like more extreme drought or extreme temperatures, or more flooding. And plant species, some are hardier and can adapt to some of these changing climates, and some of them are probably not going to make it. But again, like I said, the drought and fire and insect outbreaks can be the cause of vegetation changes. And we're kind of already seeing that. One of the examples that we kind of have been seeing over the past few years is the Doug fir around Fisherman's Bend and up the North Santiam Canyon. We've been seeing a lot of those Doug fir trees dying out, and we think it's because of the climate changes and such great extremes, with it being really wet in the wintertime and really dry in the summertime. The temperature extremes are just getting more pronounced, and they're not being able to handle those extremes in the climate as much. But we still have a lot to learn about this, and I don't know that we're ever going to get a handle on it if things continue to keep changing as quickly as they are. So that is my transition slide into invasive plants. So I just wanted to put this out there because there's a lot of different terminology. So we have weeds, we have non-native plants, we have noxious weeds, we have invasive species or invasive plants. So kind of in general, a weed is anything that's growing where you don't want it to grow. So it can be any kind of plant. It could be my native Douglas aster as a weed, because I do pull it out of my yard in different places. Non-native plants, and then to throw out some more terms, exotic plants, alien plants, non-indigenous plants. It's just any plant that's not known to historically occur in an area. And then invasive species is something that has aggressive growth and displaces other plants and animals. And native species can be invasive. So an example of that would be like juniper in Eastern Oregon, kind of taking over some of those sagebrush habitats. Or it could be the Douglas aster in my yard again. So lots of examples. And then a noxious weed is something that has to be legally designated as a pest. So like by a county or a state weed board or a national entity. So somebody has to say this plant is bad for it to be considered a noxious weed. So some of the characteristics of invasive plants, a lot of them lack natural enemies, particularly because a lot of them are not from our area. They're from different continents and different countries, so we don't have those natural enemies to keep them in check. Again, they're almost always non-native. They grow really fast. They produce a lot of seed, and they can do it quickly, and they disperse their seed well. Some of their seeds live a really long time in the ground. Some thistle seeds have been shown to live almost 100 years and stay viable in the soil. The invasive plants have few habitat restrictions, so they can grow almost anywhere. And then they can form these single species stands or monocultures like blackberries, big thickets, and crowd out the native plants. So just some impacts. They outcompete other plants for water, nutrients, and sun. They cost a lot, and they're difficult to control. They can crowd out wildlife and fish habitat. So crowd out the desirable species. Some can be toxic. They can decrease your property value. If you have a whole bunch of blackberries or English ivy, somebody might not be super excited about purchasing your property if you're trying to sell it. They can impact our recreation areas. Again, they spread rapidly. They can add to wildfire danger, and they can affect your farm with your crop yields or some of your grazing potential. So some specific impacts to wildlife. Again, if you have invasive species taking over and crowding out those native species, you're going to have reduced food for the wildlife. And you could have potentially reduced areas for nesting. And then eventually you could make the wildlife go away. So you would decrease the diversity. So different species might choose to not use that habitat anymore. Impacts to streams and rivers. They can take over the native plant habitat and you can cause higher water temperature. So if you have blackberries come crowding in and they displace all the native taller trees, they're going to reduce the amount of shade that's available for that stream. And then they can create, again, more soil erosion. So blackberry roots are not very extensive, so they don't provide a lot of erosion control as much as some of the native plants that either have deeper roots or roots that go out further. And then again, you're going to lose habitat for the insects that the fish feed on. So what can you do? Learn to identify weeds and know what the bad ones are so that you can get rid of them. Drive on established roads. Don't do a lot of off-road driving because you don't know what you're driving on, and you can be like this picture of this really old pickup truck that has some diffuse knapweed stuck in it, and they're carrying it all over the place. Don't pick flowers or plants if you don't know what it is. When I was little, I remember giving my mom lots of bouquets of dandelions when I was little, helping spread those plants. Tell other people, have them help them identify what weeds are, and clean your recreation gear, clean your pets. If you've been in an area where you know has weeds, because your pets are going to carry those seeds, and clean your boots. How many people have, I can't do this, it'd be nice if we were in person and I could say, how many people have boot brushes that you carry with you and you use them to clean your boots off every time you go for a hike or go somewhere? So hopefully most people do. A little bit about controlling invasive plants. There's several different ways of controlling. Mechanical control as things like mowing, hand pulling, burning, and solarizing, which would be like laying down plastic or another heavy material, usually plastic, to try to burn those plants and heat them up. Cultural control would be shading, so that would be putting down like different kinds of fabric and shading out those plants, or you could use like cardboard or newspaper or something like that. And planting the appropriate competitive vegetation. Biological control are usually our insects. And so it's usually a slow process and doesn't necessarily 100% get rid of a plant, but it'll usually kind of keep the populations in check and keep them from spreading. This is kind of a last resort for different plants, and I have another example of that coming up. And then chemical control using herbicides, which can require repeated applications. And there's different ways that you can get it onto the plants. You can spray it, you can wipe it, you can paint it onto the stumps. But we always, if you're going to use herbicides, we always caution you to use it according to the label. So make sure you read that label. There's lots of directions and instructions on using herbicides. So here's my biological control slide. This is tansy ragwort, and these are a bunch of cinnabar moths munching on that tansy ragwort. So that's a great example of a biological control. And I'm sure most everybody in here has tansy on their property and has noticed that tansy's been pretty relentless the past few summers. And especially this summer, we had a large infestation of tansy. And we think that was due to the really wet spring that we had that impacted some of the biological control agents. There's a flea beetle that feeds kind of on the roots. And we think that that really wet weather impacted the flea beetle population, which the flea beetles are actually more effective at controlling the tansy than than these cinnabar moths. So we didn't have that flea beetle working on the tansy this year, and that really helped the population along. So I talked to a lot of people about tansy in August, which is not the right time to be thinking about controlling tansy. You need to do that in spring. Spring is the best time to control tansy. Even, you know, you can't see it, it's not as visible, but getting out there when it's just a small rosette and the leaves on the ground is the best time to control it, because once it gets yellow flowers, your options are limited and you really just kind of left with pulling it or cutting kind of those flowers off, which is unfortunate. Because if you mow it, it could still flower and spread seed. So just some control information in general. Integrated pest management is a term that we like to use. And that's just essentially using various methods in combination. So like I was talking about earlier, like mowing blackberries and then spraying them. Or you could have other things. You could mow and then hand dig or something out. Then you monitor your site and make sure that you stay on top of any regrowth or new populations that come up, and then follow that by active restoration, planting, and continued maintenance. So you can't just kind of do one thing and then walk away and forget it, because the weeds are just going to laugh at you and they're going to come right back. This is an example of that weed control calendar. And like Brenda mentioned, timing is really important in when you perform your control measures. So this calendar shows the plant species on the left, and across the top, it has your seasons and months of the year. And then it also shows the life cycle of the plant, which is these green lines. So it'll tell you when it's flowering, when it's bolting and growing tall, and when it's kind of senescing or going dormant for the winter time. And then this shows you manual or mechanical control methods and the time of year to do it. And then also chemical control methods and the time of year to use herbicides. So these calendars are amazing. They've just been coming out the past few years, and this is a brand new one that was put out by Metro or City of Portland. So this is brand new, just in the past few months, and it's pretty comprehensive and it has a lot of information in it. So I highly recommend that you check out this calendar in your resource thumb drive. And then I did have this in here about blackberry control. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but essentially the most effective treatments that we've seen are what I mentioned earlier, is cutting and then using an herbicide on it. You cut the plants in late summer, late August, early September, and allow them to regrow about 4 to 6 weeks until they're about 12 to 18 inches tall. And then you use herbicide on them. If you are not comfortable using herbicides, that's okay too. You know, everybody has their ways of dealing with invasive plants. You can still mow them repeatedly or use tilling and kind of hand removing and grubbing out those canes. Just know that it's going to take longer and you'll have to keep doing those multiple cuttings per year for several years, but eventually you'll kind of wear down the resources in those plants and they will eventually not come back. So we're going to go into quite a few species here. We'll just kind of breeze through some of these and then we will call it an evening for vegetation. So false brome is a grass. This is the first one on the list. This grass it's very fuzzy and very hairy. And it has kind of these drooping seed heads. So this kind of combination of the drooping seed heads and the really hairy, fuzzy leaves are kind of main characteristics. And then if you really want to get kind of technical, if you look at the blooming or the seed heads, the seeds are connected directly to the stem. there's no secondary stem right here like this plant. So here's the main stem, and then here's a secondary stem for each of the seeds. This false brome does not have that secondary stem, if that makes sense. Hopefully everybody kind of gets that. I'm really worried about this plant in the fire area. There's quite a bit of it known up in the along the Little North Fork and North St. Anne River. And this plant is known to expand greatly after wildfire. So I'm a little bit concerned about what this plant is going to do. And this is what it can do. This is a picture of a forest understory along the North St. Anne River, and everything that you can see in here, except for a few sprigs of Scotch broom in there, is all false brome. So it spreads pretty rapidly. It can grow in sun, it can grow in shade. It doesn't care. Tansy ragwort, we talked about this one a little bit. It is toxic to cattle and horses. So if you have grazing animals, it's really important to control this plant. Knotweeds, this, in my opinion, is actually the worst, probably invasive plant in the Willamette Valley. It's really difficult to control. They grow really fast and really aggressively. There's several different species. They're all bad. It blooms later, July through October. It can get up to 12, sometimes taller. Their stems look like bamboo. They kind of have these oval heart-shaped leaves. They have these little dainty white flowers, clusters, and they're usually found along streams, but they will do fine just growing in upland areas as well. This plant dies back to the ground every year and then can grow that 12 plus feet tall every single year. They have a really strong root system. These plants can grow up through concrete and into foundations. They'll find cracks in concrete and in foundations, and there's pictures on the internet of it growing like into people's basements and things like that. So it's just a really aggressive plant, and it's difficult to control. If you cut it down, you just make it mad, and you just make the roots spread out further. So this is a fun one to deal with. Yellow flag iris it's pretty. It grows in water. It blooms in May, June. It grows about 3 to 4 feet tall and has these bright yellow flowers along water. It has seeds that float, so it knows how to move around. And if anybody's familiar with Staten, this is the pond by the pharmacy and the Dairy Queen. This was in about 2014 or 2015. The entire pond was ringed with yellow flag iris, and we worked with the local landowner on a control project, and there's very little to none of the yellow flag iris remaining in this pond today. So that was a great success story for that control piece. The next one is garlic mustard. Most of the green you can see on this hillside is garlic mustard. Right now, we don't know of any garlic mustard in Marion County. It's really widespread in Multnomah County, and there's quite a bit of it in Clackamas County. It has these scalloped leaves. It's also really bad in the Midwest and the Northeast United States. It has little tiny flowers, tiny white flowers. It's a really kind of unassuming plant. But the one thing that gives this plant its power is that it is what we call allelopathic. And so it has chemicals in the plant that don't allow other plants to grow near it. So once it gets started, it just keeps growing and prohibits other plants from growing around it. And it's a mustard, so it gets these long seed pods, and when they pop, the seeds fly out and can disperse pretty quickly. And it's shade loving, so it's found in forest understories. Moving on, this is a old man's beard. It's a clematis. There's lots of ornamental species of clematis that get big, beautiful flowers, and lots of people plant the vines in their yard. This one is very aggressive. It grows faster and taller than English ivy. This is it growing up into a big tree here, and it can also spread along the ground. It's pretty dainty white flowers. And then these are the seeds. That's why they call it old man's beard, because they kind of look fluffy and like a scruffy old man's beard. It is a woody vine and it's deciduous. So in the wintertime, you don't really see very much except a woody vine kind of climbing up the tree. The stems can grow up to 90 feet long. So it can, has the same impacts as English ivy. We're getting close to the end. Shiny geranium. This one, I've been seeing a lot of it in the burned area in the fire. This is a picture I took at North Santiam State Park. It's growing out of the cracks in the drinking fountain. So this plant doesn't even need soil to grow. It can grow in like a little bit of moss, which is unbelievable. I've seen it growing on the sides of trees, like in moss and rocks. Here's a kind of a close-up of how that's growing in there. And this is what it does. This whole understory of this forest is all shiny geranium. It's an annual plant. It's really easy to pull. It gets little pink flowers. It has reddish stems. You can like kick your foot in the dirt and you can kick up these plants, but it's just so prolific and such a prolific seeder. It has multiple generations per season. So it just grows so fast and spreads so quickly, it's really difficult to get control of it. And this is related. This is Herb Robert. It's another geranium species. This one isn't as prevalent in Marion County as the shiny geranium. And this one also has red stems, but it's hairier and it kind of has fern-like leaves. You can see the leaves a little bit better here. And it does have an odor to it. Another name of it is Stinky Bob. So if you know somebody named Bob, you can tell them there's a plant named after him. This one is the last weed on the list. This is water primrose, and this has been kind of a priority for us the past few years in the North Santiam watershed. In this picture, you can see all this green mat of a plant that is all water primrose. It's highly aggressive. It grows very fast. It grows in waterways. It can clog waterways. It gets pretty yellow flowers. It just grows a ton of biomass every single year, and it can grow like 3 feet out of the water, and then it has just a lot of roots and other biomass in the water. It takes over habitat for fish and wildlife, and just clogs up tons of waterways. If you're familiar with Minto Brown Island Park in Salem, a couple of the sloughs there are completely covered with it. I lied. It's not the last one. Sorry. Meadow knapweed. This one is along the North Santiam River is where I've seen it most. It gets these big pink flowers. There's nothing kind of in particular about it. Pink flowers are pretty distinctive. They're probably about 1 to 2 inches in diameter. It can spread pretty quickly, but it likes kind of roadsides or gravelly areas. It flowers kind of late in August. This bud on the flower is pretty distinctive. These kind of brown, they're called bracts, and you don't need to learn that terminology. But there is a great biological control for this. They're weevils. So and the weevils are pretty widespread. So almost every meadow knapweed plant that I've seen, if it's in flower, you can usually see some weevils digging into their seed head weevils, so they eat the seeds. All right, we're getting done here. What can you do about the weeds? Oregon Invasive Hotline. So this, if you want to report invasive infestations, you can go to this website. It's also great for helping with identification. For Marion County, if you put in a report, you will hear from me. I manage the hotline for Marion County. So if you see something, you can also just email me. And I'm also good for if you have lots of plant pictures, if you need to know what something is, take a picture, email it to me, text it to me, and I can usually get back to you and help you with identification. Some different resources besides what's in your packet or the thumb drive that Sarah gave you is the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They have great noxious weed profiles. The Oregon Invasive Species Council has great information. Marion County does have a weed control district, and they have a separate weed list, and you can report noxious weeds to Marion County. They have technically they have enforcement authority, so you can tattle on your neighbors if they have weeds and call Marion County. I mean, they don't have a heavy hand, so I shouldn't be throwing them under the bus here. In King County, Noxious Weeds in Washington, they have a fantastic website for identification and learning about weeds and how to control them. And then again, here's the Oregon Invasive Hotline. This Garden Smart book is fantastic. If we're meeting in person, I would hand one of these to all of you. But I did put it in the supplemental or the additional materials section. This shows you invasive plants, and then it gives you native and ornamental alternatives that are great to plant instead of the invasive plant. And then here's our native plant sale. Orders are all online right now. It'll be open through February 26th. If you go to our website, marionswcd.net, you can find information for the native plant sale there. We'll have 70 species of native plants. Pick up on March 12th and 13th. And if you really want to learn more about native plants, there's going to be a workshop on February 9th that's hosted by the Lucky Mute Watershed Council called Planning and Planting Your Native Garden. So you can, I think there's information on our website under the events tab on our website, or you can go directly to the Lucky Mute Watershed Council and you can sign up for that workshop. And that's it. Whew, 7:10, made it just in time.
Thank you, Jenny. That was excellent. I want to point out that you can also get one-on-one advice from the SWCD. If you want a site visit, we can talk to you about native and invasive plants that are on your property and help you find the best ways to manage them. Jenny is available and I'm available, just depending on on the timing and all of that. So yeah, if you want a site visit, you want to learn about your plants, go ahead and give us a call. There are a number of questions, Jenny, so we'll just get right to it.
Oh boy.
Ben asks if there are plans or ideal hole diameters available for the native bee house shown.
Oh, I took that on OSU campus. I don't know who actually created that. I just happened through there one day. I live in Corvallis and I saw that and was like, this is fantastic. And I took a picture of it. So I do not have any plans for that. And it was several years ago. So unfortunately I don't, but if you want information kind of about mason bee houses, I can get you that information if that would be helpful.
All right, and you can contact us for that. You can send us an email, send me or Jenny an email, and I'll forward you to her. So how about, is there a list available for Western Cascades native plants, lower elevation?
Yes, there are several lists. There's, so you don't want Willamette Valley, you want Cascades plants? Is that kind of what the question was? I can stop sharing here.
That's what the question was Western Cascades.
Foothills, okay. Yeah, there are different resources. There's some actually really great pollinator guides that are for different sort of habitats. And I think there is a Cascades one. I'm not sure, I have to look into that, but there is also a plant guide that was produced in Portland that's called Native Plants for Willamette Valley Yards, and it shows some different ecoregions, and I think they do, some of the ecoregion that it covers is kind of that Cascade, West Cascade ecoregion. So you could also check in there too.
Great. All right, Jordan mentions that PCC Rock Creek has a wonderful collection of native bee and insect housing to view in their bee garden. That's just some information for folks if they want to check out some pollinator
Awesome.
habitat or house ideas. Ben shared the link for native plant resources on the website. Jenny, do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. On our website?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So on our website, we have native plant profiles for several trees, shrubs, ground covers. So you can get information on where they grow, what they look like, plants on there. That bloom table is on there. There's also a low water use native plant list on there, which is also in your resource thumb drive as well. So just a kind of a smattering of different native plant resources.
Great. So Lynn shared information about the USDA NRCS Plant Material Center's field guide to the ID and use of common riparian woody plants of Intermountain and Pacific Northwest. There are a number of really great books that about native plants in our area. Jenny?
Yes, that's a great book for riparian plants. The Plant Materials Center out of Corvallis has a great website and lots of resources, native plant resources on their website as well. They've also, the NRCS has also put out a great plants for pollinators in Oregon, and I believe that's also in your thumb drive of resources. So do poke around in there. There's a vegetation section under week 2 that has information that we talked about. Also, that yard and garden section has plant and vegetation resources as well.
Great. And I always like to throw in a plug for Pojar and McKinnon, a book called Native Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast. I think there's also one for the Valley.
I think that coast one covers the Valley, but it's a great, yeah, that's a great book too.
It's great for beginners. It's got lots of pretty pictures. And for me, that was how I kind of got started with my native plant identification. So I recommend it to other folks.
Hi, I didn't have my camera on, sorry.
You're good. Let's see, a free hedgerow class at Oregon State. I'm guessing that's OSU. A hedgerow printout from the extension.
Oh, she talked about the book, the Riparian Woody Plants book. She got it from the hedgerow class. I think that's what that was.
Gotcha.
At the chat. Yeah, I think we might have a few of them at our office still. I'm not sure. I'd have to look. I had a stack of them for a while, but the Plant Materials Center might have some. So if you're interested, let me know and I could see if I can dig up a hard copy for you if you are interested in that.
Great. So what can you interplant around the oaks?
What to plant around the oaks? There's lots of different species that are kind of associated with oak habitats. Some of our shrub species would be the western serviceberry, ocean spray, red flowering currant would do great in oak habitats. And it also depends kind of on what your plant community is. If you have kind of an oak savanna-y where you only have a few oaks per acre, then you would plant kind of more prairie type plants. If you have more of an oak woodland, you might have a little bit more shade. So then your species would be a little bit different. So yeah, if you have oaks, it'd be great to maybe see that habitat and I can maybe come out and check out your habitat and provide some sort of specific recommendations for your site.
Great. So someone is asking about the growth rate of Oregon white oak, giving an idea of how tall or wide it will be after 5 or 10 years.
Oh goodness, after 5 years, it might only be 5 feet tall. 10 years, I don't think it would grow a foot a year, but you know, in 5 or 10 years, yeah, it might only be 5 or 10 feet tall. It depends on kind of the site. If it gets a little bit more water, maybe it would be a little bit taller. But it's pretty slow growing. Sarah, do you have any ratios for that?
Not Not really. I think it also depends on the site. If it's a really dry site, it's going to be slower growing than if it's a wetter site,
Right.
or you know, depending on how much vegetation it's competing with as well. It really doesn't like shade, and it's really slow growing. So if you plant it with other plants, it's likely that even the shrubs might be able to shade it out when it's young. And the Doug fir will definitely grow up and shade it out as it gets older. Or the Doug fir can start small and shade it out a 200-year-old oak
Right.
in a matter of 20 years probably, or a little more. So very slow, but worth the effort, I would say. What kind of small trees and bushes would be good on a 30 to 45-degree slope?
That's going to be pretty site dependent too. Like, is it rocky soil? Is it deep soil? Is it north facing? What direction does it face? So that it depends on a lot there. So, you know, I think almost any of the shrubs that I recommended in here would be good. It just, again, it depends. If it's south facing, then you're going to want to plant things that are obviously pretty drought tolerant and can handle that exposure. And then I have there's a good document from Washington it's kind of for riparian areas, but it's also for slopes, and it shows and talks about rooting depth and how plants root, like if they spread out, if they're fibrous rooted or tap rooted. That can be really helpful too. So if you're trying to control erosion on that slope, you'd want to plant something that has kind of a more fibrous spreading root system than something that has a tap root. So I'd have to see the site to make more specific recommendations, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
That just means that you should call Jenny up and have her come out for a site visit. So then there's a question. I'm curious how long it would be before the area would experience significant shading. So they're talking again about the Doug fir on oak.
Right. Yeah. The Doug firs are going to grow much faster than the oak. So, for oaks, how long it would be before the oaks would okay. I guess I'm confused. So how long before the oaks would provide shade, or how long before the Doug fir would shade the oak?
I think he's asking how long before the, that's a good question. Let's see. Doug firs are high competition. I'm curious how long it would be for the area. I think it's how long before the Doug firs shade out the oaks.
Yeah, if you planted an oak and a Doug fir at the same time, the oak won't have a chance, unfortunately. So you're really going to have to keep that area free from firs for dozens of years. I mean, the oaks grow so slow, and like I said, probably in 10 years, you might have 5 feet of growth.
All right. And then are there detailed maps of native plant distribution around Marion County?
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good question. I don't know that. There's in the soil maps, in the soil descriptions, it tells you what kind of vegetation is associated with that. We do have historic vegetation maps. Do we have current vegetation on GIS maps, Sarah? Do you know?
I don't know about that, but in the tech sheets that we gave everybody at the beginning of the class, at the very last question is about historic conservation habitat for the site, and it'll say something like oak woodland or conifer riparian or something of that sort. So that gives you an idea of what your land probably had historically. I don't know about modern vegetation maps.
Right, I don't either. That's a good question, Jordan. I can look into that. But there's definitely, like with the soil maps, there is they list a few different sort of plant species that are common in different soil types. So that's one place that you could look if you're looking specific, like for your property. We can look at the soils and then get some of the vegetation types from there.
All right. Benton County has teens trained to look for invasives. Do other county SWCDs offer this service?
No, I know they have their teen weed spotters program is what that is. And we haven't done that in Marion County. I don't know about other SWCDs, but I know Benton County does that. And there's several different, weed spotters programs and different like citizen science programs that can train volunteers to go out and do surveys for invasive plants.
All right. So we have a 12, I might actually be close to the end. Let's see. We kind of need to wrap this up here, but we'll throw a couple more questions in here. Wild rose, native or not, kind of root system and propagation techniques?
There's several native species of wild rose, and there's a few invasive species of wild rose. So how's that for a non-answer? So root systems, many of our native wild roses are what we call rhizomatous. So they'll their roots will spread and then they'll pop out another plant, and then they'll spread a root and then they'll pop out another plant. So they don't usually go very deep. They're not very deep rooted. They're kind of closer to the surface. In propagation techniques, if you have a population of that, you could probably just cut pieces of them off and replant them in other places because they are rhizomatous, so they'll keep spreading.
All right. Someone suggests, or Paul suggests that survey records may also have info on historic vegetation.
Right. That's what I think the historic vegetation maps that I was referring to, I think those were created using some of those historic land surveys.
All right, and then one person asked if Nootka rose is native here.
Yes, that's one of our native roses.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was super awesome.
Awesome. Thanks for all the questions, everybody. That was great.